Hi, everyone. I welcome you on behalf of Doing Sociology to this interview with Professor Kamala Ganesh, who was formerly the head of the Department of Sociology at the University of Mumbai. Her fields of interest include gender and kinship, women's history and archiving for women, culture and identity, and Indian diaspora studies. She has been an ICSSR Senior Research Fellow, a scholar in residence at Shiv Nadar University, and a fellow at and visiting professor at Leiden University, the Netherlands, and Münster University in Germany. Most recently, she has been the M.N.Srinivas Chair at the Institute of Social and Economic Change, Bangalore. And we are very honored to have Professor Ganesh here with us today. So welcome, everyone, and especially Dr. Ganesh. Thank you for taking time out and talking to us today. To begin our conversation, I'd like to know from you, that for the younger generation in both sociology and social anthropology today, there is a general, even if not informed, skepticism about science. From a time when the claims and desire to be recognized as a science were givens, there has been a major shift. So can you elaborate upon this shift? Also, was the fact that in the initial stage, when anthropology, sociology, and other social sciences unambiguously defined themselves as the heirs to the natural sciences, science was seen as the great redeemer and contrasted with religion, belief, and superstition. And that no longer is the case that accounts for the shift. How would you assess the implications of this shift for the scientific endeavor, if we can still use that term? So if you could just throw some light on that very long question of mine.
Thank you, Deepali. And also thanks to Rituparna, with whom I have been corresponding, and the others in your team. As one who has spent some time engaging in archiving, I have archived the Cancer Institute at Adyar, Chennai, and also done an archiving of the documents of the Indian Association of Women's Studies. Also some work on SNDT Vice Chancellor's archive. So I'm very honored to be asked to be part of your archiving exercise, and happy to share some of my ideas and work. Today, what I'm going to share with you is based on my article for a book edited by Geeta Chadda and Rennie Thomas, just published by Routledge, and it's called Mapping Scientific Method, Disciplinary Narrations. It is a wide-ranging examination of the way scientific method has figured in the discussions and debates within different disciplines, from the natural sciences to the social sciences and humanities. My article is titled Betwixt and Between: Anthropology's Engagement with the Sciences and Humanities, and I'm drawing quite a lot from that article for today's conversation. Now, let me respond to your question. I wouldn't use the word skepticism per se, so much skepticism about science per se, but I think it's more of a skepticism about the universalistic claims of science. The tension between sciences and humanities has been more in anthropology, at least in the West. There, sociology and social anthropology are still somewhat separate, more in US and Europe than UK. Sociology allied itself with other positivist social sciences, economics, political science, and so on. Anthropology, in fact, in its early stages, saw itself as closer to natural sciences. Now, the reasons for this is the four-field approach, what is called the four-field approach in anthropology, especially in the US, but even elsewhere to some extent. Anthropology used to include physical anthropology, which includes observation of tangible and measurable entities, use of scientific instruments which are aimed at precision. So it had some claims to objectivity. And the whole effort in anthropology, early anthropology, was a strenuous attempt to achieve this scientific objectivity and precision. In the early integrated anthropology, that is the four-field anthropology, culture was also included in the same approach. by implication as tangible, measurable, and predictable. So this, I think, itself led to a certain self-awareness in anthropology, because social anthropology, due to the very nature of its subject matter and mode of research, pushed it to become self-aware quite soon. This internal churning within anthropology, combined with developments in society at large, precipitated a powerful questioning of the givens of social anthropology. Broadly in sociology too, similar processes were happening, though I'm concentrating on anthropology in the West. There are variations in quality and intensity, but this is the way it developed. I would like to quote an incident from recent history of AAA, that is the American Anthropological Association, to show that the skepticism is not a really anti-science, but it is the scientific claims of universality. So in 2010, there was a crisis in AAA. AAA, American Anthropological Society, was established in 1902. It's an old association established by distinguished anthropologist Francis Boas. And it's the world's largest scholarly and professional organization of anthropologists, and arguably the most influential. It has always included the 4 fields of anthropology in its ambit and considered itself as the science that studies humankind in all its aspects. Over the decades, one section of the membership had become increasingly uncomfortable with the label science. In 2010, the purpose statement of the association dropped the word science, which had always been there from 1902, and said, instead, that the purpose of the association shall be to advance the public understanding of humankind in all its aspects. Understanding, public understanding, not scientific study. A furor ensured, and the latent and deep tensions between these two factions, those who were inclined to see anthropology as a science and those who sided with anthropology as one of the humanities, this tension burst out into the open. After the widespread indignation and condemnation from the former, and I won't go into it, it's quite a colorful set of events that happened. Eventually, the word science was reinstated. By the end of 2011, the association officially brought science back with the statement, "The strength of anthropology lies in its distinctive position at the nexus of the sciences and humanities, its global perspective, its attention to the past and present, and its commitment to both research and practice." So this explicit inclusion of science has continued since then up till now. So by no means can we say that sociology and social anthropology have ejected science from their scope. It's more like a cautious, limited use of scientific methodology for specific purposes and more for validating other modes of inquiry. In India, within sociology and social anthropology, there are 2 major groups today. One comprising of students, teachers, and researchers. And the second group are professionals in various fields with a sociology or a social anthropology background, and who are now working in marketing or management, advertising, civil service, human resources, development studies, NGOs, data sciences. So this second group, they practice, to the extent that they practice sociology, they practice a largely empirical positivist sociology with a penchant for combining quantitative and qualitative analysis. They may not be questioning science in a fundamental way. Where it is raising fundamental questions, as I said, the critique of science within the disciplines is more focused on scientism or scientistic analysis. What has changed within sociology and social anthropology is the polarization between the science and the humanities, or the aspects of science and the aspects of humanities within their disciplines. The other thing is what is happening in the world around us. Broad changes, globalization, technology, and also the rise of particularities and specific identities and so on. This is not confined to anthropologists. This is happening the world over. This too has an effect on the way sociologists and social anthropologists deal with science.
Thank you for that response, Professor Ganesh. Moving on to our next question. You mentioned two pieces by Merton suggesting very different takes on science. Merton recognized that scientific discovery is often a chaotic blend of failures and accidental successes. Yet, when he investigated science as a functionally integrated social institution, whose role was the extension of certified knowledge, his position was very different. How would you understand this gap? And would this be likely today?
Yeah, well, Robert Merton, the American sociologist, is known for his contribution to developing sociological concepts and theories. I would like to add a footnote here that I think in 1969, when my department, the Department of Sociology, Bombay University then, celebrated its golden jubilee in a very big manner, and I was nowhere in the picture then. I believe Robert Merton was one of the invitees. And when the great man came, the entire department at that time was in real excitement to see him. I mean, he carried a lot of professional weight and celebrity around him. Well, he is also acknowledged as the founding figure of the subdiscipline of sociology of science. Most interestingly, pretty early in his academic career, he co-wrote a book with Eleanor Barber called Travels and Adventures of Serendipity, a study in sociological semantics and the sociology of science. Merton, we are told, was exploring this concept of serendipity from the 1930s onwards. He wrote the book in 1958, but intentionally left it unpublished, and therein hangs a tale. The book had a fascinating career. Merton used it in his later work, and would cite it. But no one else could get to read it tantalizingly. Finally, in 2002, he agreed to get it published in Italian on the condition that he would write a long afterword. And then in 2004, a year after his death, this was published in English and then made available to the English-speaking public. So Merton lived with this book and its contents for half a century without making it public. The question arises, why? The book became famous after posthumously, winning extravagant praise as being captivating, the best written and most entertaining book of sociology ever written. Its style is light-hearted, but its content is quite serious. It has ruminations and reflections on the role of serendipity in scientific discoveries, how the actual process of discovery is chaotic. It has failures, it has accidents, it has intuition, but the style in which it is presented in scientific discourse, rather it is required to be presented in scientific discourse, which is with the use of elegant and parsimonious with words. It doesn't let us on to this messy process that is there behind. Merton talks about the serendipitous patterns in empirical research, the unanticipated anomalous data, which then becomes the occasion for developing a new theory. Now, this is quite different from Merton's more formal work in the sociology of science, which has been criticized, which was path-breaking at its time, but has been criticized for restricting itself to institutions and norms and not on the content of science, not about the impact of society on science. That is, not taking into account science as a cultural and cognitive product, not about how science defines knowledge, how scientific knowledge is created, but science as a functionally integrated social institution whose role was the extension of certified knowledge. Succeeding generations of sociologists after Merton from David Bloor onwards, asked more fundamental questions on the form and content of science and pushed the subdiscipline beyond the earlier boundaries. So what catches one's attention in this charming story of unpublication is that despite his brilliant, original, and entertaining reflections on serendipity and science, and prescient, actually, reflections on serendipity in science, his formal work does not reflect this. What is the gap due to? It could not be that he did not know. He did know from the later publication of his early book. We know that he had many of these ideas in his head, but why did he not express them in his formal publications? We can speculate that this could be part of a larger malaise of the protocols of academic writing. What is known as now as new ethnography, with its emphasis on writing cultures, takes up the protocols of writing up the findings in social anthropology, the pressures of scientific presentation of data, issues of credibility in the academic community, etc., that forces one to adopt a style that obscures the reality of the field and fieldwork. I'm sure some of you will remember or know that Malinowski's monographs came up for much criticism posthumously when his own diary, written at the time he was doing fieldwork, was published. It was published posthumously, and where Malinowski gives vent to his frustrations in the field and his fantasies and his views on the natives in a very frank and colorful way, which does not come through in his monographs at all. So the gap between what he wrote in his diary and what he wrote in his monographs is this gap. But this is not likely to happen today, to answer your question. The terms of the debate have changed now, and that is what has really happened in this questioning of science. The criticism of Malinowski and also of Margaret Mead, another cultural icon whose work was later questioned, whose ethnography was later questioned as not being an honest account of what she actually experienced in the field. All this could be seen as a disenchantment with the authoritative truth-telling style of the anthropological monograph. So in this way, the new developments in anthropology made reflexivity not just acceptable, but kind of mandatory. How did science, from being a framework for sociologists and anthropologists, how did it become an object of study? This is hinted at, it's a sotto voce in Merton's Serendipity, but got carried forward and beyond by others, as I mentioned. Now, among social sciences, sociology and social anthropology have the largest canvas and scope, because everything that involves human beings and relationships among them is part of its ambit. So as new social developments and societal trends, new events, technologies happen, new fields of knowledge also emerge and mature. Sociology absorbs them and gives a place to them as a specialization or a subdiscipline. For example, family and kinship, urban sociology, rural sociology, medical sociology, all these were very early subdisciplines of sociology. Sociology of the informal sector, sociology of Dalits, sociology of women, these came somewhat later, I would say after the 70s. And a sociology of science too developed a little later. That is because in the beginning, both sociology and social anthropology defined themselves as sciences. At that time, science was not a field of knowledge, but a synonym for knowledge itself. So sociology and social anthropology defined their work as contained within the framework of scientific knowledge, its assumptions and its methods. These were taken for granted as the ground, so to say. Ethnographic data was used to substantiate the point about science being a cultural system by the later anthropologists and sociologists. Detailed ethnographic studies of the way science labs function and the process by which their research gets the glaze of science is there in many such publications, including Bruno Latour's famous book. So this has established that scientific knowledge, like any other system of knowledge, is not immune to examination and analysis, is not inured from chance and coincidences and accidental success.
Professor Ganesh, a central argument of yours is that anthropology in the West tackled the divide between the sciences and humanities in a distinctive way due to its subject matter of studying other cultures and due to the methodology that evolved for this, namely ethnography with participant observation. Could you please elaborate on this important point at a time when decoloniality is a buzzword in Western universities?
Well, sociology and anthropology developed separately from each other in the West. This is not the case with India, as we shall see later. They had their different purposes. Sociology evolved as the study of changing Western society post the Industrial Revolution. When transplanted into the colonies, it became both descriptive of the transformation to modernity that these societies were undergoing and prescriptive, evaluating modernity positively. Anthropology's mission, on the other hand, was to document the vanishing cultures of small-scale, so-called primitive cultures in the colonies for scientific purposes as well as administrative purposes. Anthropology developed self-awareness or reflexivity pretty early. This was due to its defined subject matter and methodology of ethnography with participant observation. The colonial origins of anthropology are well known. In practice, the encounter of Europe with other cultures crystallized out into the subject matter of anthropology as being the study of other cultures. And the sotto voce here is that it is the study of other cultures by Western anthropologists. No other discipline was defined in this way by who can study whom, where, and how. The geographic location of the object of study and the origins of the subject, that is researcher, defined the identity of the discipline. This was the foundational character of anthropology, and this was an inherent and serious contradiction with science and its claims of universality. So this is how, due to being situated right in the heart of this contradiction, anthropology became quickly self-aware. Given the initial material in the form of accounts by travelers, missionaries, and administrators that arose from their visits, prolonged stays, and interactions in different locations, this mode became the base for the methodology that evolved eventually into ethnography. What were ad hoc, casual, at times motivated by different motives, interactions that got systematized into ethnography. In this process, the yen or the yearning for scientificity is evident. Let me give you the example of a publication that became a go-to publication for anthropologists of that early period. I'm talking about Notes and Queries on Anthropology. Even though ethnographic fieldwork with participant observation is seen as an invention of Malinowski in the early 20th century, actually from the mid-19th century itself, efforts in Britain were on to collect ethnographic material on a scientific basis. Late century ethnographic protocols were still nascent, and the field manual called Notes and Queries on Anthropology was published by the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The first edition was in 1874, and there were 5 more editions, 1829 and 1951, and that spans 75 years of evolving ethnographic protocols, and it forms in cumulatively a fascinating document on how these protocols were changing, evolving. and finally got kind of set. Several distinguished British anthropologists of the time were associated with each edition. The various editions show how the protocols were not static or fixed, as I said, and they underwent shifts over the decades. The preface to the first edition in 1874 states that it was aimed at travelers and other non-anthropologists in far-flung colonies to help them to collect information systematically and supply it for scientific study by scientists, anthropologists, scientists back home in Britain. This is a precise description of how the discipline of anthropology itself came into being. So actually, in the early stages, the demand for ethnographic data for colonial administration was not strong. That developed later, after 1892, as the exercise of data collection became more elaborate and more systematic, and then furnished possibilities for administrators to use. In the early editions of the Notes and Queries, ethnography was one part. The first part was actually on anatomical observations, physiological observations, and a medical section. In later editions, ethnography was emphasized on much more. By the time of the last edition in 1951, the space for physical anthropology and archaeology were much reduced, and the contents leaned heavily towards ethnology and social anthropology. So this in Britain mirrors what happened in India also later. The separation of the contents of anthropology into physical anthropology into a separate wing, so to say, and social and cultural anthropology to another, whereas in the US for a much longer time, they were still integrated. The comprehensive scope, minute details, and the elaborate instructions to ensure accuracy and precision in observation, collection, collation, tabulation, and classification that are evident as we go through the Notes and Queries editions, they give us a panoramic view of positivist empirical science of that time. By treating human, biological, and cultural data together in one sweep, Notes and Queries illustrates how the science of anthropology furnished a base to produce ethnic and racial stereotypes and create biases. But looking at it cumulatively in their shifting emphasis in consecutive editions, Notes and Queries also throws light on ethnography as a self-consciously envisaged work in progress. And it also has seeds of that self-reflexivity. The same broad format continues through 75 years, but there are important changes in every edition, a result of intensive reviews after every edition was published. It was nothing if not meticulously organized. There is a growing concern to enhance scientific techniques, a need to hone the tools of the questionnaire to elicit facts with greater accuracy and fidelity to the source. Also, the exigencies of the field situation throw up nascent issues of cultural translation and ethics that decades later led to a fundamental questioning of the conventional ethnographic mode itself. But we can see the seeds already in Notes and Queries. For example, even though initially favoring detailed description, when the anthropologist W.H.R. Rivers got involved in reviewing early editions for the 1913 edition, he was very critical of this descriptive survey approach. Facts themselves were not enough, he said. The manner of gathering was important. He recommended intensive and immersive fieldwork, studying every detail of the life and culture of the people, speaking their language, and building close personal relations. So this is how the later day ethnography, its form and structure evolved. And I quote here, "It is only by such work," says Rivers, "that it is possible to discover the incomplete and even misleading character of much of the vast mass of survey work which forms the existing basis of anthropology." This was just to give you a glimpse of how self-awareness and self-reflexivity was built in from a very early stage, even though it was not the dominant, it was not dominant and prevalent everywhere. Way back in 1950, in his merit lecture, Evans Pritchard made a powerful critique of anthropology's pursuit of science and suggested that it identify itself with the humanities. In the following decades, beneath the overarching positivist structure functionalist framework in anthropology, many different currents flowed, expressing greater ease in identifying with interpretive, intersubjective modes and reflexive modes of doing research. So, following structure functionalism, we have Leach, Levi-Strauss, Geertz, and then the new ethnographies, all of which are leading the way to what anthropology eventually became. But change also came not just from internal churning, but from other developments. The dismantling of colonial empires and the rise of native anthropology, the women's movement and the emergence of feminist anthropology, and so on. But we shall see that in a little while.
Professor Ganesh, since you talked about, you mentioned feminist anthropology, my next question is sort of based on that. In fact, you've written on the significant role of feminist anthropology in critiquing mainstream anthropology and also furthering the debate on anthropology as science. So could you throw some light on this?
See, the second wave feminism, as we call it sometimes, or the second wave women's movement, various names, but basically the movements in the late 1960s and 70s, they led to two significant academic outcomes. One was the emergence of women's studies as an interdisciplinary space. The other one was reappraisal of the disciplines in social sciences and humanities for their gender sensitivity. It was not, the latter was not and is not a standard exercise, but it would depend on each discipline's historical roots. What are the fundamental questions of that in that discipline? What is the trajectory of internal debates? All these would then be relevant when we reappraise the disciplines for their gender sensitivity. Now, anthropology as a subject matter, its subject matter is lived culture, you could say, and that is it's ascertained or elicited through the beliefs and practices of men and women in specific locations. So women are part of the subject matter of anthropology. They are visible too. But anthropology was not a gender-aware discipline, because early, the traditional anthropology had commonsensical ideas about the naturalness of gender asymmetries, being the asymmetries as part of a functional division of labor. Gender was not problematized as a cognitive category. Sex and gender were not distinguished from each other, nor were power relations between the sexes the focus of any study. And ethnography, with all its arsenal, was not geared to elicit women's voices. Mostly the ethnographers were male and white, who were either seeing women through their own, that is the male white ethnographers' own cultural lens, or through the lens of the male informants of the culture that they were studying. Paradoxically enough, in early anthropology, 19th century and late 19th century anthropology, the position of women was a subject of inquiry. The position of women across cultures and across historical civilizations. And there were a lot of theories around that, speculative history from an original matriarchate moving to patriarchy, or the other way, that there was always patriarchy, never a time when there was no patriarchy. These kinds of statements were made. I mean, they showed a concern with women's status, but women's status was a trope for civilizational advancement or backwardness. Now, because of its speculative history, evolutionism was discredited and the topic was dropped. A little later, in the early and middle 20th century, Margaret Mead is well known for her culture and personality studies and her studies on sex and temperament in 3 primitive societies, where she compares women's the way women's personality is influenced by culture. So that was a good early contribution in comparing women cross-culturally, not without its methodological and other problems, but still. But anyhow, largely in the 20th century, women were dismissed or neglected as a subject of anthropological inquiry. There was an assumption that women had no socially significant roles universally. Now, from the mid-70s, 1970s, feminist anthropology started developing. And that was the time also that all the disciplines were being looked at from this gendered lens. So women who had trained in anthropology were inspired by feminism, and they started forming a very closely knit global network. This was also the time of inner churning within anthropology, as I have already said, and not necessarily with gender, not necessarily gender sensitive. For example, critical anthropology and postmodern ethnography both were critiques of mainstream anthropology. But critical anthropology did not pay any attention to, did not pay much attention to the question of meaning. And postmodern ethnography, had an underdeveloped sense of politics. So feminist anthropology, in a nascent form, just as it was developing, it was far more prescient and bridged politics and meaning in a better way than postmodern ethnography, for example. So ethnocentrism is an issue that anthropologists have always talked about, but feminists added the concept of androcentrism, showing the androcentrism in traditional anthropology, showing where the gender bias lay, showing the invisibility of women in a cognitive sense. So the point that they made was that if what is considered to be objective scientific inquiry misses out on the most important dimension of gender relations, its texture, its structure, then what kind of objectivity is that if half of humanity is excluded from its sight? So the cultural location and the lens of the researcher and his hierarchical position with respect to the field was already at the same time being interrogated. But gender, the lacuna that came by not considering gender seriously was specifically brought in by the feminist anthropologists. What they did was they revisited older ethnographies to show the gender bias, and then they were also retrieving gender sensitive writing from women anthropologists who were in the field, who did not call themselves necessarily as feminists, but who were sensitive to the intersubjective nature of knowledge creation. Feminist anthropologists also did fresh ethnographies, showing the hierarchies in the field, methods on how to give voice to women, both in the doing and writing of ethnography, how to acknowledge the field as co-creators of ethnographic knowledge. I'd like to mention very briefly that at the turn of the century, that is 1999-2000, I was in the Netherlands working with a team of 2 other Indian and 1 Dutch anthropologist. We were working on the changing welfare state in the Netherlands and looking at its impact on the lives of the elderly and on the lives of single parents, on the life of children of divorced parents, and so on. So one thing is that we the Indians were doing field work in the Netherlands, which is a kind of a reversal of the normal way of research, the normal direction of research. But we were also concerned with how this material, what we were doing, how would it make sense to the people whom we were studying, and what were the ways in which we could involve them in the process as co-creators. For example, once we had finalized not finalized, once we had come to a working draft of our volume, we had a meeting with all our informants, more than 100 of them, and presented our tentative findings to them and got their feedback on how they felt we had understood their situation and so on. So we made some efforts like this to involve the field, which is, I suppose, nothing very dramatic. It is quite simple and to be done, but it is not always done. So the field, this field of feminist anthropology has also evolved over 3 decades. It's not the same that it was in the 70s and 80s. From women and feminism, there is a move towards understanding gender and its cultural construction. And there are more women anthropologists, feminist anthropologists from different social segments now. Women of color, minority, Black, Dalit, and lesbian women have entered the field, changing the character of what is studied and how it is studied. There is greater attention to history, to multi-sited ethnography, and a very clear stand against essentialism, which comes in with the greater focus on difference, identity, and intersectionality. Owing to the cross-cultural and historical depth of anthropology, and particularly of feminist anthropology, there is a going beyond modernist notions of masculinity and femininity. A realization that patriarchy is not a monolith, but it varies in history and cultures. And patriarchy does not necessarily negate agency. Women are more than just victims. They are agents at the same time. So there is a more nuanced idea of women's agency. It can include complicity. It could include self-policing, negotiation, as much as it includes resistance and protest. So some of the feminist anthropologists well known who have made a distinguished contribution, I would include Diane Bell, Joke Schrijvers, Patricia Kaplan, Shirley Ardener, Louis Lamphere. There are many. In India, the feminist anthropologists and feminist sociologists, here there is not that much difference, as I'm going to talk about that a little later. In India, there is a very strong linkage of feminist anthropology to women's studies and to the women's movement as well. People like Leela Dubey, Maitreyi Chaudhary, Prem Chaudhary, Rajni Palriwala, Ravindra Kaur, there are so many, and they all have links to activism as well as to academics, as well as to women's studies, not staying strictly within the disciplinary kind of borders. In fact, I would like to quote here Iravati Karve's prescient work on women and kinship systems. She did not identify herself as a feminist, but in the 50s, in the early 50s, her book on her tome on kinship has a very sharp and incisive section, a small section on women and kinship systems, where she looks at the implication of different types of kinship systems for the life of those, for the lives of those living within them, in material terms, how it makes a difference to their entitlements, to the resources that they get, to the symbolic capital that they have, and so on. I mean, she uses different vocabulary, but for her, I mean, even though she didn't identify herself as a feminist, I think Patricia Oberoi has called her, I think she says one of the first feminist anthropologists in India to have taken up kinship with reference to gender. Now, one of the features of the Indian scenario is that because of the Indian diversity, we are all very familiar with our castes and classes and regions and languages. And as sociologists and social anthropologists, whether we engage with gender or not, we have engaged with these just by virtue of being here and working here. And so I think the intersectionality that comes into feminist anthropology has been a little easier in the case of in the context of India.
Professor Ganesh, you talked about self-reflexivity. Now, I'd like to know from you, how is self-reflexivity a part of the constitution of social anthropology in the West and sociology in India?
Well, as I have mentioned earlier, though I didn't go into too many details, the very subject matter and methodology of anthropology in its early stages had created a situation that triggered reflexivity. The intimacy of the ethnographic encounter, for one, or the one-on-one intensive, immersive interaction over a long period of time, the juxtaposition of vastly different cultures in a very deep interpersonal way, and the hierarchies and inequalities in the field between the researcher and the researched, between the country of the researcher and the country of the researched, and so many. The challenges from feminist anthropology, as I just said, and another important one being the rise of the, so to say, the native anthropologist. Dismantling of colonialism and the rise of non-Western trained anthropologists in the former colonies, who were looking at their own societies and cultures, brought in a challenge to traditional anthropology, questioning its very self-definition. What if anthropology is defined as the study of other cultures by European anthropologists? What happens when the anthropologist is non-white and is studying their own society and culture? And a little later, what happens when a non-white, like me, for example, studying the Dutch, studying culture and communities located in the West, what happens then? These are the questions that trigger reflectivity. The change in location, researcher, and researched equations are a source for self-reflexivity, not only in the West, but also in India. The awareness in India, it is the awareness that the conventional division between sociology and social anthropology is not tenable, because that basic equation is disturbed, the European studying non-Western cultures. But there are some additional factors in India. On the one hand, the context of nationalism and nation building, there has been a relook at what it means to be an Indian social scientist. This has engaged, all educated Indians, all Indians, and sociology particularly. So there has been a collective self-reflexivity in the context of nationalism, I would say. It has precipitated concerns on the imitation of Western categories of thought and a need to indigenize, as well as an evolving stand vis-a-vis value neutrality. Value neutrality was part of the original concept of sociology, but taking sides, doing committed research, committed anthropology, public sociology. So these concepts are quite popular in India. This was an entire community being collectively reflexive on the need to make anthropology relevant and authentic in its national location. So this is one kind of self-reflexivity, in addition to the other one that comes from the very nature of this intimate encounter. Yet another kind of reflexivity in India comes from working in a large and extremely culturally diverse country, also one with elaborate and explicit social hierarchies, where there is a consciousness of the great inequalities and incompatibilities. I think this is another source of self-reflexivity in the Indian context.
A final question, Professor Ganesh, is on Bombay University's Department of Sociology, and you've been associated with it for a long time, and it is the oldest department in the country and is more than 100 years old now. How has the intertwining of sociology and anthropology happened there?
This is a question close to my heart, because I am from Bombay University then, both as a student and then later as a teacher. I did my PhD from Bombay University. Actually, I started out as an undergraduate student in chemistry and then wanted to switch to sociology for my MA. And Professor A.R. Desai, who was then the head of the department, was very happy and welcoming. But the university at that time did not permit the switch between the arts and the sciences. From the sciences to the arts even was not permitted. Now, of course, the situation is different. You can do an entrance exam and you can get in. So I did my MA from SNDT University, which did permit at that time. But anyway, I was always a Bombay University person. But not just because of that, I think it is important, the way sociology and social anthropology have been dealt with in Bombay University is important because that is the approach that has characterized much of Indian sociology for the last so many decades, even though there have been some criticisms about this. Even then, in practice, there is a lot of convergence between the two, I would say. So it was the first department, obviously, oldest department, that propagated a unified approach to sociology and social and cultural anthropology, going against the grain of the West. But social anthropology has had a checkered career in the department, despite that despite that kind of a beginning. Manorama Savur, one of my senior colleagues, has written very perceptively on the colonial pressures to start sociology rather than anthropology as a department in Bombay in 1919. And yes, we have completed 100 years and more. The first head was Patrick Geddes, who was a town planner and urban sociologist, a British town planner and urban sociologist. But he was there, very, very distinguished, and made some very important interventions. My friend and colleague Indra Munshi is writing a book on him, and there have been many books on Patrick Geddes. But in practice, Govind Sadashiv Ghuriye was in charge of the department from 1924 till 1959. He had a very, very long innings, and in practice, he gave it a shape and he took it in a certain direction. And I would say he gave shape not only to the department, but in that period to sociology in India. Whatever evaluation you might make of that, he was initially selected to study sociology in UK by the Bombay University. Under L.T. Hobhouse in the London School of Economics. He went there, and for some reason, he left very soon and switched to anthropology under Rivers at Cambridge University. We still don't know the reasons why he made this switch. It is possible that he coming from a Sanskrit and Indology background in India. He felt when he was exposed to anthropology in Britain, because in India back here, it was only sociology department in Bombay under Geddes, who was also a Pakka sociologist. So he might have been exposed to anthropology, and maybe his background inclined him to switch. We don't know, but he switched. And so he came back and took over as the head of Department of Sociology in Bombay University, but championed an integrated view of sociology and social anthropology for Bombay and for India, I would say. He was supported by N.A. Thuti, one of the lesser known but very distinguished anthropologists from Oxford, who was also there in Bombay University in those early days. So Ghuriye, I just want to talk about how Ghuriye implemented his project of integrating sociology and social anthropology. He called it cultural anthropology in Bombay. So we always say social/cultural anthropology here. He implemented his project of integration at 3 levels. At the level of teaching, he included a number of courses on anthropology in the syllabi, and he opened up 2 permanent faculty positions, which are even continuing today. They are meant, there is a professorship of cultural anthropology and a readership of cultural anthropology. And you can see that we follow the British nomenclature, reader and professor and so on. And the MA and PhD students, he had a huge number of MA and PhD students, and many of them did anthropological field work. Some of them did sociological work. So he had both kinds of students. So in other words, he didn't make a distinction between the two. His own research was quite versatile, including Indology, folklore, social anthropology, philosophy, but he was not a field worker. He did not do ethnography, though I think Srinivas has mentioned that sitting in his armchair in Bombay University, he directed a whole lot of students to do field work in different parts of India, and that included Srinivas and many others who went on to become very distinguished sociologists. Second is his outreach through journals and through institutional collaborations. The Indian Sociological Society was set up by Ghurye, and its flagship journal, Sociological Bulletin, has been coming out to date from that time, and they don't make a distinction between sociology and social anthropology. They have both kinds. The bulletin publishes both kinds of articles, and so that distinction is not made. He also encouraged collaborative links with two important institutions of anthropology in Bombay at his time. One is the Anthropological Society of Bombay, which was incorporated into the Asiatic Society of Bombay. It was set up in 1886 and had a journal, and the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Bombay, which was published beginning from 1886 to 1936. And then after a break of a decade from 1946 to 1973. The proceedings of the society and the articles in the journal, if one has the patience to go through them, and I have browsed through them, not gone into it very seriously, but here is a treasure trove awaiting young anthropologists' curiosity. This gives a panoramic view of almost 1 century of what anthropology in India meant. The journal covers an array of topics beyond the strict anthropological concerns: folklore, Indology, art, antiquities, caste histories, ethnographies, contemporary social and social reform issues. Its geographic canvas is all India, and plus a few other regions in Asia. The contributors are a mix of Indians and non-Indians, but in the later issues, we see that Indians become more prominent. A.M. Shah, who has published a few articles from the journal, he calls it a voluntary initiative of individuals, a true collaboration between British and Indian scholars. Well, it was more an institution of learning rather than directly political, unlike government-sponsored ethnographic survey of India set up in 1901. But of course, the colonial imprint on knowledge making is there. But even so, one would look at this institution as a somewhat scholarly collaboration between scholars from multiple locations. In the initial stages, the journal has a very, very broad sweep, and then it becomes a little more specialized and starts using technical vocabulary. And with time, the contributions from Indian scholars increases. Now, what was Dr. Ghurye's role in this? The department was thoroughly involved with the Anthropological Society of Bombay. Ghurye had been its president for some years. M.A. Tuthi had been the secretary. Iravati Karve, M.N.Srinivas, I.P. Desai, J.V. Ferreira, A.R. Desai were all members. They presented papers at the meetings of the society. They contributed to the journal. So this was a way in which the university sociology, Ghurye made sure that the university sociology was engaged with an anthropological association. The other one, the second institute that Ghurye encouraged was connections with the Institute of Indian Culture. What it is called as now, Institute of Indian Culture, was actually the SVD Catholic Mission in India, whose founder was Stephen Fuchs. Stephen Fuchs was an Austrian missionary and anthropologist trained by Wilhelm Schmidt. a pioneer of the culture historical approach. Schmidt had set up the Anthropos Institute in Germany. Fuchs worked at the SVD indoor mission from 1934. He went back to Vienna to do his PhD on a topic straddling ethnology and Indology. He came back to India in 1955 and closely collaborated with Ghurye to set up an anthropology department in St. Xavier's College. I mean, to date, St. Xavier's College has a sociology department and an anthropology department. The university only has a sociology department, which also includes anthropology. So Fuchs established the Indian branch of the Anthropos Institute for Anthropological Research, and it was later on renamed as Institute of Indian Culture. Fuchs' work as a missionary and an anthropologist, he had a dual mandate among the Dalit and tribal communities of central India, is truly splendid work. He kept his commitment to anthropology at the forefront. He too kept his links with Ghurye and with the department, and it has become a tradition now. I mean, it is an informal tradition that usually there will be someone from the Institute of Indian Culture who is on the faculty of Mumbai University Department of Sociology. It started with Professor J.V. Ferreira, and then later with S.M. Michael, and currently M.T. Joseph. There is a tradition of link between the Institute of Indian Culture and the University Department of Sociology, and this is a link of anthropology. So what happened after Ghurye? What happened to anthropology in the department? As I said, J.V. Ferreira was an anthropologist and Professor A.R. Momin was an anthropologist, but always the sociologists outnumbered the anthropologists. Ferreira and Momin had a theoretical contribution to make to the discipline, the former with philosophical anthropology and the latter with the civilizational perspectives, but they did not do any major field work. At that time, when Ferreira and Momin were active, the more prominent person in the department, professor in the department, was A.R. Desai. With his Marxist perspective and his activist inclinations, he was also a charismatic teacher. So a group of students and colleagues coalesced around him. My colleague Indra Munshi, who was part of that group, she remembers that there was a divide between the Marxist group and the rest, among whom were the two anthropologists. Each was in their own bubble, and no academic discussions or debates happened across these bubbles. None of the Marxist group, she said, had any expertise in anthropology, but they had a vague disdain for its colonial associations. Anthropology was not attacked, but simply bypassed. Now, the department, one must say, although a pioneer in integration of sociology and anthropology, did not show any sustained engagement for various reasons, as I mentioned, with the internal developments in anthropology from the West in recent decades, from where a powerful critique of scientism was emerging. After the 1990s, the department has gone into a new phase where a growing diversity of approaches characterizes it. Marxism has become less influential. With new faculty, feminist approaches, Dalit approaches, and engagement with tribal issues has become more popular. Students are more receptive to anthropology. There is a focus on marginalities using both sociological and anthropological methodologies. There is more intermingling between sociology and anthropology. So to conclude, my own position about sociology and anthropology is that their lineages are different, and the lineages do make a difference to the identity. But the two are very close. They are closer than any other pair of social science disciplines, I feel. In India, the distinct methods of the two became available to each other, enriching their research. Of all the methods, in my view, ethnography has the greatest potential for self-reflexivity. But it has been used by both those inclined to sociology and those inclined to social anthropology, and also people from other disciplines are also using ethnography as a methodology. But it is not my case that methodology is the ethnography is the only methodology that leads to self-reflexivity, because it is, I think, to try to track ideas and approaches to a single source is really contrary to the reality of the constant messy give and take and intermingling that keeps happening between disciplines. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Ganesh. It has been incredible just listening to you. You've shared wonderful, insights on to begin with, the question of sociology, social anthropology, science, and now, you've addressed the last question, which was about the Bombay, Mumbai University. So it has been just wonderful listening to you. Thank you so much for taking time out and talking to Doing Sociology. And I'm very sure all our listeners are going to take so much from this interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.